Do you have a boring personal brand bio? Is it the kind of bio that people are quickly clicking off of or scrolling past and not even reading at all? Today I want to talk about my top 10 tips to write a more memorable bio. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. My tip number one is to write a magnetic hook. Now, I know this is popular copywriting and marketing advice, but I also love to draw inspiration from books because I think that authors do this really well. Pay attention the next time you're reading to the very first line of the book. This is often designed to be a really compelling hook to get you to keep reading, and really great authors will integrate this throughout the book as well. They will have a hook for every chapter. I know that you already know that a hook is designed to pull you into the rest of the communication and get you to keep reading. But what I would encourage you to do is try and think outside of the box as to what that hook could be, because it doesn't necessarily just need to be you jamming in all of your experience into that first sentence. You can try and find a more unique way to have a hook. What I personally do at the moment is that I start my bio with what I'm not, and it acts as a little bit of a contradiction to the usual sell. But what I like about that is that I'm highlighting up front what my personal brand, what my services are, and highlighting that they are not for certain people. So those people can just click off really quickly if they need to, but hopefully I am setting the scene for the types of people that will resonate with my story. Which leads me into tip number two, which is to know your story. Humans crave storytelling. For tens of thousands of years, we have been hardwired to understand our experiences through storytelling. And the research supports this as well. It shows that when a fact is shared with a story, it is 20 times more likely to be remembered than when that fact is shared on its own. So, how are you weaving storytelling into your bio? How are you connecting a narrative that is compelling for your audience? And if you have trouble trying to define your story, then that leads me into tip number three, which is to follow a storytelling structure. There are a lot of storytelling structures around, and storytelling as a general framework has been around for thousands of years. So they are tried and tested methods. But my favorite is Donald Miller's story brand framework, which he shares in his book, Building a Story Brand, because this is really designed to suit storytelling in a commercial context in particular. He highlights it in terms of marketing and business specifically, but I think it is very useful for your personal brand as well. Because one of the key things that this 7-part framework reminds you is that even when it comes to your about me, for example, it's that your about me isn't necessarily just about you. It is actually about your audience. This 7-step framework begins with the hero, and the hero in the story isn't you, it is the person that you are communicating with, your audience member. And your hero has a problem and they meet a guide, and that is where you come in. And you are a guide with two key important elements. You have authority and you have empathy. You are a guide who has a plan, and you call your audience to action. And you show them what failure could potentially look like, you show them what success can look like, and you take them to that transformational state. Now, in this framework in particular, I feel there are two elements that are worth a particular special mention. So that leads me to tip number 4, which is to infuse empathy and authority into your bio. So if you struggle to push past and find ideas for all of the different elements of the storytelling framework that Donald Miller presents, then I would suggest to, at least as much as possible, make sure that you can tick these two very important boxes. Empathy is not about you manipulating your audience. It is simply about you putting yourself into the mindset of that audience and showing that you understand that mindset. So it communicates that you understand the way that they might be feeling. And this is often actually about putting your own experiences back into the story. It's not about making up false empathy or false sympathy. It's about sharing why you came to do what you do. Why did you create the product that you did? Why did you start to work in the service that you provide to others? Tapping into that experience that you might have shared can help to align that shared experience with your audience. And in a way, having that shared experience adds to your authority, which is that other key element. But what I also want you to really think about with this as well is your authority is your credibility. So if you are offering a particular product or a particular service, or if you are professional in the industry, then what is your credibility to be in that particular field? This is where, if you think about the empathy as potentially being more emotive and more storytelling, the authority is where you are actually adding in the evidence. So I like to see this as almost being that blend between the storytelling and the facts and why they work so well together. So this is where you put in your qualifications, whether that's formally, whether that's your industry experience or both, and what is actually going to add substance to the claims that you are making in your bio. And when it comes to your authority, remember that that is not necessarily just linked to your current title. Your authority can come from your entire experience. So make sure that you're not relying so much on your current title and you are considering the complete aggregate of your career and your professional work or your business to really highlight the credibility that you bring to the conversation. So by now you probably have a lot of notes about the points that you want to make in your bio, which leads nicely into tip number 5, which is to write for the space. I recently read a book by a florist, and she was describing that her process, anyway, is that she begins with the vase. So it doesn't actually begin with the design or the arrangement of the flowers, but the vase. And she designs the arrangement to suit the space that she is working within. The inspiration comes from the vase first. And I thought this had a really nice link to design in general. As someone that used to oversee graphic design teams, I really understand the value of writing for a particular space, because when you have to write for a particular space, it makes you a lot more intentional about the words that you are choosing. And by doing that, then your bio is going to become a lot more intentional. So you're seeing it as not just this web page that you have all the space in the world to be able to write whatever you want because you have the flexibility on a web page, but you're really thinking about how exactly you want that to be presented on the page. How are you creating a bio that has a little bit more visual interest, for example? How are you varying paragraphs? How are you making it easier for your reader to be able to digest the information? And I like to be as specific as paying attention to things like what is called orphans in graphic design, where a single word drops onto a new line and there's only one word on that line, and you then have to go through and edit to make sure that that doesn't actually happen. So start to actually edit and pull together your bio in the space that you have available, because when you are doing that, your bio is going to become more compelling. Which leads nicely into tip number 6, which is to have every word earn its place in your bio. When I read the book Writing for Busy Readers, I loved that it highlighted a former Times editor who used to challenge her writers to make sure that every word earned its place in a sentence, and every sentence had to earn its place in a paragraph, and every paragraph had to earn its place in the feature overall. Every idea had to earn its place. And I want you to try and think the same way when it comes to your bio? How are you making sure that with every element that you include, you are adding value in some way with each of those words, with each of those ideas, and you're only including what actually does add value? Now, by now, you might be thinking that if you are being this blunt and this succinct with your bio, that maybe it is now starting to come across as a little bit bland, but that is where tip number 7 comes in, and that is to edit for your tone. If you had to define your personal brand in a few dimensions, in maybe 4 or 5 dimensions, what would they be? I want you to think about that and then infuse that tone into your bio. So this is where you can go through and make slight adjustments to make sure that that tone of voice that is authentic to you, or what you are aspiring to have in the industry, comes out in your bio. And this isn't about changing every single word and overcomplicating the piece of communication, because there is such sophistication in simplicity, and that is the most effective way in most circumstances to be able to communicate. But it's just making little intentional changes. So maybe you might find a word here or there that is potentially a little bit beige that has a more exciting alternative. And just with a few of those additions to your bio, it's going to start to become more engaging for the reader. But there's also a few more things that you can do, which leads me to tip number 8, which is to make your messages sing. I've done a whole other episode on how you can make your messages sing that goes into more detail, but for the purpose of this episode, I just want to highlight just a few top takeaways that might give you some inspiration for your bio. You can, for example, use alliteration. So that is where the start of the word sounds similar to the start of another word. And this is just really pleasing when you hear it. It's just like music to people's ears. And speaking of music, you can also add rhythm to your communication. So you might have a certain flow that makes it sound more appealing. You might have, use of a rhyme, for example, that again just stands out to the reader, or just seems a little bit more engaging than just your normal bland communication. You might also like to consider arranging things in threes. As humans, we are naturally compelled to look for patterns in our environment. And when things are arranged in threes, it means that we can start to recognize a pattern. So it's a number that we generally are a little bit more drawn towards. So how can you start to arrange some of your communications in threes? Another little trick that you can try is to create contrast in your bio. So this is a really important concept when it comes to visual design. You create contrast so that the most important elements of a design can pop. So think about this when it comes to your writing in your bio as well. How are you creating contrast? How are you showing opposing ideas? How are you highlighting your value compared to something else, or the diversity of your experience to create a more captivating contradiction, for example? So try these little tips to make some of your more bland sentences sing. My tip number 9 is to package your profile. I personally think that the use of headings when it comes to your bio is almost like the chef's kiss on a bio. It allows you to be able to digest the information in a much easier way, and to also then be able to see what the overarching narrative is of the communication, and you can connect that narrative through headlines. I think we use headlines so carefully when it comes to, copywriting or advertising or in other communications, but sometimes when it comes to web pages, we can forget the power of a really compelling headline, because your headline for your bio doesn't need to just be about me. It doesn't need to be so literal as to what it is. You can find a way to infuse more of your personality, more of your brand, more of your industry into the titles that you choose. I, for example, have headlines on each paragraph of my bio, but I also have an overarching headline too, which at the moment is on a personal note. And I like like the reference to personal, and I love the integration of this because it links nicely into my overall brand related to personal branding. So when it comes to your own industry or your own profession and whatever it is that you offer, how can you infuse more of that language to just package up your communication in a much more exciting way? And my tip number 10 is to create memorable moments in your bio. In my bio, I don't just mention that you might likely find me with a tea. I mention that you will most likely find me with a green tea. I don't just mention that you might find me with a red wine. I mention that you might find me with a South Australian Shiraz. I don't just mention that you might find me watching the NBA. I mention that you'll find me watching a Denver Nuggets game. Your bio is a chance to just be a little bit more specific in the details without having to add a whole heap of extra words, but just infusing a little bit more detail that just makes it a little bit more exciting. But the idea is to also make this relevant. So, for example, by me highlighting that it is a South Australian Shiraz that I enjoy, it's a nice tie-in to where I am located in South Australia, which is known for its wine culture, but I offer my services Australia-wide and internationally as well. And I mentioned Shiraz specifically because this is my signature drink of choice, and over time it has become something that people recognize and remember about me. So I'm just trying to embrace something that has already been a part of my personal brand, and same goes for green tea. I also mention piano in my bio, but I don't just mention it in terms of, you'll be able to find me doing this. I use that opportunity to link the skills that piano gives me to what it is that I can actually offer in my services too. So I make it relevant. And that is where I think if you are going to include things like your hobbies and your interests, it's really nice to just try and make that relevant where you can to your audience too. And sometimes if you can't do this, that's okay as well, because at the end of the day, you might just have someone who connects with your interests and your hobbies. And that's the reason that when they are reading your bio, they realize that you are their people. But I do think infusing just some of those more personal behind the scenes things are a really nice touch, because if you see yourself as a character in a story, for example, or if you think about when you're watching a movie or reading a book, you normally have some sort of context, you have some sort of world building where you start to understand that character in a little bit more detail. So I just think that infusing some of those more personal behind the scenes elements helps people to connect with the person that you are more holistically and understand how you fit into a bigger picture, and it just helps to build a little bit more of that trust. And I also have a bonus tip, and this isn't related to writing, but this is to add a visual hook to your bio. Now, I know that a standard approach to your bio is probably going to be to have your usual headshot image, but I like to encourage you, if possible, to think outside of the box and see if there is another opportunity here too. What I do like about the standard sort of headshot profile image for a bio is that it does feel like that person is communicating directly to you, like they are looking into your eyes and they are talking to you. So that is a nice element if that's what you're working with. But if you have it available to you, do you have a photo, for example, that shows you in action? Is there a way that you can add credibility to what you have discussed in your bio? They are actually probably going to connect with the image first before they actually read the details of your bio. But I do think that it's a nice opportunity to maybe create a little bit more of an immersive experience, take them behind the scenes, show them something that makes you credible into what you are talking about. For example, you might have a speaking photo which adds to that credibility that they are reading about in your bio. And I think a really nice win-win, if you can manage it, is to find an image that feels like you are still connecting with your audience, but also adds credibility or takes them behind the scenes as well. This is where I think a speaking image, if you have it, can work really nicely, because it can often look like it is taken from the perspective of someone who is an audience member. And so I just think that that is a really nice touch too. If you want to learn more about personal branding, then subscribe for more like this, and I'll see you in the next episode.